So is it actually possible to deploy 1 inch behind ruins and genuinely stop small bases from getting into combat with you? As it seems like that common 40k manoeuvre might be less possible than I thought it was. Let's do a deep dive into one Gamey Warhammer 40k manoeuvre, talk about if it's possible, and whether or not people at large will be annoyed at you doing it in the first place. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd revisit one interesting area of 40k gameplay weirdness. I've talked about this a few times in the channel on the past, last time around a year ago or so, updating it for 10th edition, basically talking about the trick where you deploy models just behind a ruined wall, so the opponent can't properly get into an engagement range with you and has to go around making their charge longer. The subject got brought up again to me recently though, someone reaching out to the channel via email, sharing some interesting maths and showing that the manoeuvre isn't actually always possible to be done. I thought it could be a good excuse to revisit and talk through those tables, and maybe an excuse to ask a few channel polls as well as to how common this is in practice and how annoyed people might be to see it on the other side of the tabletop. Let's talk through the basics of this one kind of fast, and then examine those two issues and the potential fixes that people have tried to do for it in the past. This slightly gamey charge screening trick has been an issue for Warhammer 40k for a few editions now, if indeed you consider it an issue. It does certainly feel unintended to me, though it could be seen as taking up good defensive positions in a bit of terrain to give you an advantage, and really does give you a slightly peculiar reward to forming up in defensive lines behind ruined walls. The idea behind it is to make it difficult for the opponent to engage you. So say for example you've got this unit of Space Marine scouts occupying this ruin there, they're going to be charged by some Chaos Terminators, but because the scouts have deployed themselves in an annoying way, just 1 inch behind those ruin walls, it means that if any of the Terminators gets to outside of the ruin walls, they won't be in engagement range. Because the Terminators have great big 40mm bases, there's no way that they can fit those bases just inside the ruin walls in the gap between them and the scouts. So because of the scouts taking up those defensive positions, it basically means that your unit has to charge to the end of the formation. So say the shortest possible charge would be the green arrow here, as opposed to going directly into the unit how you'd expect, which could mean that the charge gets significantly longer in the right pieces of terrain. In my experience, it does tend to be at least fairly commonly used in tournaments and things, just par for the course and expected, though far less so in casual games because it's just a bit weird. For variants on it, you could also make a charge kind of painful as well, say leaving a gap so that one model could get in, so a charge could be technically possible but maybe not deal all that much damage and you could hit back in return. Say if just the one Orc boy was able to make it to the other side of the ruins but his friends weren't, they wouldn't be able to support him with melee attacks as they're out of engagement range with the Space Marines, and they can't fight through the Orc boy as they're not within base contact anymore as he's the wrong side of a wall. As mentioned though, it feels a bit weird to people newly encountering this though, if they haven't come across it or heard about it before. It only makes a fair bit of sense for knights, vehicles and monsters, as they generally won't be able to cross ruin walls like that, but just with the way that the rest of the game rules work, there's the general sense and expectation that infantry and beasts and things don't tend to be slowed at all by ruin walls, so the feeling is they should be able to charge and just ignore that bit of terrain. It's only really the practicalities of these physical terrain bits and the model bases that prevent them. It is the way that the core rule works though. Games Workshop did briefly try and fix it previously, and when their fix ultimately turned out to be worse than the problem that it was fixing, they abandoned it, and in the past have even FAQ'd it to basically say that yes, this is still in the game. In my opinion, probably seemingly unintentional, but just because there's not an obvious fix for it. It's one of the several reasons that ruins in 40k tend to be the L-shaped ones with a bunch of exposed areas, as if you have fully enclosed ones then you could make a magic box that's basically completely unchargeable if you did this on all sides. As mentioned, I feel like outside of tournament play, it's just rarely seen, maybe seen as a little bit try-hard, though obviously that's going to depend a whole bunch as to your play group and how you tend to play the game. That's the basics of the interaction, though for this one I wanted to talk about a couple of things. The set of data tables that shows which units can and can't do that, and also then some community polls as to reactions as to how much they see this in practice. I've seen it talked about in competitive groups from time to time. This could be a good example of playing by intention occasionally going wrong. I think on the competitive scene it's often taken as read that a player might say, yes, I'm going to set this up behind ruin walls 1 inch so my unit is hard to charge, and people don't actually bother to measure it out perfectly, just with the assumption that it is indeed possible. Often it is, particularly smaller bases screening out bigger bases such as the Scouts versus the Terminators here, though it doesn't seem to hold true for absolutely all units in the game. Interestingly enough, this one is a problem that you can math out with a bit of geometry if you want to, and I had a Discord user called Uncle Mel reach out to me with some interesting maths on the topic, shared via the channel's email address, and basically giving a whole bunch of data tables as to which units can do it and which units can't. The basics of the maths are this: there's two variables that could be changing for the defender, how thick the ruin wall is, represented by the grey line at Y, how big the base size of the model's defending is, represented in green here by X, and then those two parameters are going to determine the biggest circle at Z that you can fit in. So that'll be the maximum size model base that you can fit in between these miniatures. In general, the thicker the ruin wall is, the easier it's going to be to defend, as the green circle bases can basically be closer to that wall and still be outside of 1 inch of the outside of it. In general, the bigger the bases of the things defending, say if you had some big Terminators on 40mm bases, they're going to leave some bigger gaps in between, so there's more room for a bigger circle in between them, compared with if you had a line of small 25mm bases all ranked up. What feels particularly weird for this interaction is that the actual thickness of the ruin walls is actually super important and genuinely makes a difference as to what things work and what things don't. Usually it's pretty meaningless with interactions of Warhammer 40k, but could be here. For a super scientific look at this, I decided to just measure a few bits that I had lying around. From my own terrain collection, it looks like single layer MDF ones are around about 3mm in width. Plastic hard terrain bits might actually be a bit thinner than that. A couple of slightly thinner bits of plastic terrain were around about 5mm, though some of them had details that stuck out to more like 7. If you got some bigger and chunkier bits of MDF terrain, a few bits of mine that were assembled with essentially a double layer were more like 6 or 7mm in depth. Putting that all together, here are a few examples of what can charge what. For this data table, the base size of the defender is listed on the left here, so that's the size of the green circles defending, whether they're anywhere between 25mm or great big Centurion style 50mm bases. The thickness of the wall is along the top, either 0, 3 or 5, and then between the two the mass of Uncle Mel. As calculated, the diameter of a circle that can fit in with the gap. And I did check that this seems accurate, just measuring out a few examples digitally, they do seem to line up with the numbers here. It maybe did surprise me a bit just how important the difference between, say, 3 or 5mm could be. And if you have big thick walls, then the 1-inch screening trick is going to be far more effective. First up, it looks like if you're charging in with units that are on 32mm bases or anything bigger, then you're basically never going to be able to defeat this screening technique. The only one on the table that passes the 32mm base check is 50mm defending an infinitely thin wall, which wasn't exactly likely to be happening in the first place. As 40k bases have been gradually updated though, a fair few miniatures have been appearing on 28.5mm bases, and there's a few more occasions when they might be able to get through. For walls that are 3mm or less, 40mm bases probably can't screen them out, so again have a few more options there. But probably the most interesting one out of these was the findings for the 25mm bases, where basically it looks like if you're charging against a fairly thin MDF wall or a plastic card wall, this clever screening trick just basically doesn't really work on them, as at least theoretically there's always going to be enough room to fit them into the gaps between these circles and the width of the wall, no matter how the enemy deploys. It looks like even if you're trying to screen 25mm bases with other 25mm bases, there's still going to be enough room for them if you are playing on super thin MDF boards. I did find that kind of interesting, given that I'm sure there'll be a lot of examples where that's happened before and people have just assumed that it's impossible if they aren't painstakingly measuring out every interaction. It seems that even for slightly thicker walls, so say a plastic wall that was a consistent 5mm across, in theory you'd still be able to defeat the screening tricks of 32mm bases, which is super common out there in 40k, and certainly against things like 40 or 50. The numbers are kind of tight though, coming down to literally 0.3 of a millimetre. So if there's really any sort of irregularities that could vary the distance by a bit, you might not be able to make the charges anyway. Obviously that's all a bit theoretical. I feel like it's more for interest that I wanted to know that, as opposed to really applying it to the majority of games. But it does seem that we do indeed have a slightly dumb system where it could make genuine gameplay differences just how thick your walls are if you're wanting to do that kind of gaming manoeuvre. Though obviously it will depend on a few other things as well, whether the model can actually fit in with overhanging bits on the miniature, as again that could be one reason why they wouldn't be able to make a charge. Probably the biggest takeaways for that one for me are that 32mm bases should indeed be stopped from engaging if the opposing unit deploys optimally, but then 25mm bases are genuinely quite hard to screen out with this sort of way if you are playing on thin MDF walls, where if they're sort of around about the 3mm thickness or so, then maybe even 25mm bases might not be able to stop them. While we're on the subject of finer points of competitive terrain and things, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Weyand Yutani Terrain. If you are looking for some functional and competitive style terrain on the board, they've got a whole bunch that they supply the WTC with, one of the biggest and best known 40k tournaments in the world. Their terrain focuses on practical and gameplay stuff more so than aesthetics. There still comes in a bunch of fun designs. It's pre-printed with different designs that could be an Arctic laboratory or a medieval castle. It's made of their very sturdy and lightweight plastic cards that can be disassembled and stored flat. For some examples of a typical terrain set from them, they've got their WTC War Master Pack. This one's around €140 or $150 plus shipping. It gets you 4 big ruins, 6 smaller ones, and a bunch of armoured container style things, and there are base plates available for the ruins. They've got other ones as well, such as the Pariah Nexus terrain pack, this one having bigger ruins and some sort of girder forest style things. And if you just want a bit of big meaty line of sight blocking terrain pieces, they do have sets of their 4 ruins that could be added to add a bit of good line of sight blocking to maybe a more decorative table otherwise. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look. They're giving me a code Auspex5 for 5% off any purchase through them, so be sure to use that if you pick anything up. Getting back to talking gamey ruin tricks, obviously all of that and the gamey shenanigans and maths around it is all very well and good in theory land, and given that we're refocusing on this one, I thought it would be interesting to see people's perceptions of the rule and how they actually use it in game. I asked people on the channel a few channel polls. Firstly, whether or not you understand the 1-inch ruin wall, to which around about half of people said yes, 2/3 of the rest said somewhat but not entirely, and 1/6 of people responding to the poll said they didn't understand what the rule meant. So if you did go about using it in games, there's going to be a significant chunk of people that just don't understand the interaction and you'd have to explain that to them, and if anything that number might be lower than you'd expect here, given that it's a survey done on a more gameplay focused 40k channel. Then I asked you guys whether or not you use the rule in practice. It looks like while most people at least have some grasp of it, the majority of people choose not to. 54% of people said that, and then another similar sort of breakdown of around about 1/6 say that they use it in most games, and then some might vary depending on the context. As mentioned, it feels like the sort of thing that's kind of expected in competitive games that might be seen as try-hard and casual, where the focus is a bit less on fine tricksy gameplay mechanics versus a good game and maybe narrative. Then to flip things around, I asked would you view those as using it negatively or not? If someone used the screening and staging ruin walls against you, it looks like the majority of people, 60% or so, view it at least a little negatively. The majority of those that don't particularly like it wouldn't make it any sort of issue for their opponent. Only a few people would either be seriously unimpressed or raise it as something that they don't want to happen, presumably in their more casual games as opposed to competitive ones. Again, I guess this goes into using it in the right context, but it does go to show that there's some genuine bad feeling against this rule and feeling like it's a bit gamey. I did find it interesting for the numbers of this one though and how they overlap with the previous one. It looks like mathematically there's at least some people who use the rule themselves, at least on occasion, but then also view other people using it negatively, so interesting to see that little interaction there. Then finally, for people who understand the rule, I asked people whether or not they'd like it to remain part of Warhammer 40k, and for this one it seems like there's a fairly even split between yes, no, and people who have no strong feelings or don't care. It seems that the people who want to see it gone slightly outnumber the people who don't, but it's not huge. I guess for the people who don't want it removed, either might see it as thematic defending buildings, or might be familiar with Games Workshop's fixes for it in the past. Speaking for the fixes for the interaction though, Games Workshop tried to fix it in 9th edition once, and basically made a fairly straightforward rules fix stating that if you're fighting over or through a ruined terrain piece, then increase engagement range to 2 inches, but then had to rapidly backpedal on that when it broke far more interactions than it fixed. It meant that you suddenly had deep strike charges that could make it their way into an engagement range at 8 inches rather than 9, so sort of broke that mechanic. Meant that units in ruins move blocked a lot better and created some gamey charge then pile in problems, where in some cases you could make it into engagement range but then it'd be impossible to strike back. I guess you probably could have found more complex fixes for each of those situations, but it feels like it would be overall quite a big rules burden just to iron out one element of gameplay that not even everyone uses. If you're playing WTC games, so the World Team Championship pack, they also decided that they'd try and fix this in a different way to Games Workshop, and they often make various tweaks to Games Workshop's core rule set for the things that they feel aren't working effectively, or Games Workshop haven't FAQs. It was kind of funny they issued a 12-page rule document just literally trying to address this one scenario. Admittedly, quite a lot of it is explaining context and pictures with examples, but still slightly hilarious, the sheer amount of aggro that this one interaction can cause. For the WTC solution, you in general have a fairly involved rule set of placing counters on things to treat ruin walls like barricades but only in some situations, and then have some set rules for when you add or take away the tokens away. And basically the upshot is that you can fight through the ruin walls in a way that doesn't cause as much problems for interactions down the line, that ultimately I feel like most people just wouldn't want to do that in the first place due to having to deal with the slightly horrendous token situation. So maybe the upshot of this is just don't try and do the screening thing, as it's not really going to work. Overall, it does feel like it's an unintended interaction to me, due to the problems of wanting to physically put models somewhere, and then some things being able to move but other things not being able to. In general though, it doesn't really seem to be a huge issue either at a casual or competitive level. At casual play it's often not used, though if it is, then a gaming group could get on board with it if they wanted. And at a more competitive level it's just a fairly normal and accepted part of play. If just playing casually, You could also potentially invoke a sort of wobbly model syndrome style rule, basically saying that we know that the Chaos Terminators charging the wall are now awkwardly phased halfway through it while they're going about their melee. We know where they're meant to be, and they're just going to be placed next to it until they clear that wall. That feels like an easy enough way to solve it for casual games that could have some issues with precision and knowing exactly where the miniatures are supposed to be. It's not really the purpose of the wobbly model syndrome rules. In any case, though, I was certainly interested to give this one a second look. I did find it interesting that you could literally math out which bases might be able to cross the walls and engage which units. So much appreciated to Mel for sending me in that. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts down in the comments. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming. And if you've been enjoying the content on the channel, then feel free to check out the channel's Patreon page. That'll be linked down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.